I think, Ben, do you need me to do anything before I get started? Okay. All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Perlman. I'm the editor of CollectSpace.com, if you don't know me. And I'm sorry, I can't see with the light in my eyes beyond shadows of people out there. But I wanted to talk a little bit about using space artifacts and space collectibles as a means of exciting the public, and how you can get involved in the exciting hobby of collecting space. But first, let me ask how many of you are would identify yourselves as space collectors. I'll see if I can see.
Just beginning, but
okay. Okay. Well, the formal title of this is Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Space Collecting But Were Afraid to Ask. So this will be interactive, and if you have questions, just please chime in. Collect Space, for those not familiar, is an 11-year-old site that was started initially as a means of reaching out to the space memorabilia community. It has grown since then to be the largest online community for space history enthusiasts. We have 35,000 registered members and about 250,000 readers per month. And we cover everything from space history in the making to the artifacts that are in museums and in personal collections, to how one of our specialties where space exploration crosses over into pop culture, because collecting is part of pop culture. So to kick things off, I wanted to say about how not to collect space artifacts. Here at SpaceUp, we have a lot of people who work for NASA or work in the space industry. There's a story out in the newspapers this past week, and will be on Collect Space on Monday, about an individual who worked at Kennedy Space Center and thought it was a good idea to go into the trash and remove a couple of space shuttle tiles and list them on eBay. And he did. They sold 12 of them, ranging from $600 to $1,200 each. And someone contacted NASA and asked, hey, when did this fly? And they looked up the numbers and they said, wait a minute, this should still be in our inventory. And they therefore started proceedings against him. There are legal ways of collecting space memorabilia. That's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But removing them from your work site without permission is not one of them. And so that's probably the first big question that we get asked a lot, is that taxpayers paid for all this. How is it possible that you can own it? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But to start off with an example, I wanted to hark back 50 years to the beginning of the human space program. This year marks both the 50th anniversary of the first human spaceflight by Yuri Gagarin, and in May, the 50th anniversary of the first American spaceflight by Alan Shepard. When this program started off, it was very easy for people who worked in the program here in the U.S. to obtain souvenirs from the program, and almost dangerous to your life if you tried that in Russia. And it sort of has flipped situations since. So, for example, not that example, that example. This is, and physically have it here, and afterwards, since this session will run into the show and tell, we'll have everything outside for people to take a look at. This is a piece of Alan Shepard's parachute from Mercury Redstone 3, from Freedom 7, his first flight. When the parachute came back from when the whole spacecraft came back from being rescued at sea, NASA hung the parachute in a hangar at Cape Canaveral, and then basically told their engineers, including one, Harold French, that you could go in, hoist the parachute down from where it was drying, snip off a piece, and save it as a souvenir. And they did that to the point that there was no parachute left at the end. So while the spacecraft sits on display at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, the parachute no longer exists because a lot of souvenirs were sent out there. So if you see pieces of Mercury Redstone 3 parachute on eBay and elsewhere, that's how they got out. As a comparison, in Russia, there is only one known privately owned piece of Yuri Gagarin's flight, and that is a small square of fabric. When he walked out to the launch pad, he was wearing a mirror on his spacesuit so that he could look down and see the controls, the control panel above him. The mirror had been covered in the fabric in order to prevent it from being scratched, and one of the last people to let him in the spacecraft cut off that piece of fabric of his spacesuit, revealing the mirror, and kept the fabric. And that's the only known piece privately owned. His spacesuit is on display in Russia, so is his spacecraft Vostok, well, Vostok, not Vostok 1, but commonly called Vostok 1. And it's on display in a private museum, the Energia Museum outside of Moscow. But as I said, it's flipped somewhat the situation is somewhat flipped, and because of the commercialization in Russia of their space program, and because they now fly paying space passengers, you can now get things like this, which is one of the Russian gloves. And for the right price, they'll even make you a glove that custom fits your hand, unlike this one, which I cannot get past my thumb. I'm sorry? What's the price? For a full custom suit, you're going to spend somewhere on the order of $20,000 to $30,000. That's not one certified for flight. For the gloves alone, I've heard prices between $5,000 and $10,000. For a used one like this one was used for training and was used actually in their neutral buoyancy lab, their underwater trainer, similar to the one here in Houston. You can get it for between $1,000 and $2,000. This is the same type of. This is an Orlan glove. It's the same type of glove that is worn outside the International Space Station, including a spacewalk coming up this week, when 2 Russian cosmonauts will go outside and work on the Russian segment of the station. So you can find examples of spacesuit hardware. But backing up a little bit, so what are the main ways that you can find them? I've talked a little bit about examples of what's out there, but there are 3 primary ways that you can obtain legally space hardware, flown hardware. There are NASA surpluses like any other government agency. They work through the General Services Administration. Depending on what type of organization you represent, or if you're just representing yourself, there are different avenues. If you represent a school or another educational institution, there are programs now with the Space Shuttle program coming to an end where you can register, and NASA allows you to pick out items that they no longer need from the Space Shuttle program after the museums have had their say. There's also a program going on right now where NASA's giving away 7,000 Space Shuttle tiles to schools. You have to have a state Department of Education registered ID to get them, but they are giving them out to schools, and they're still up for grabs. So even if you don't represent a school yourself, if you have a child in school, if you have a neighbor's child in school, if you work with a school, you might want to suggest that they request it. It's a great way of getting kids excited about space. And the information for obtaining that is on NASA's website, but it's also available through CollectSpace. Sometimes space hardware falls out of the sky. Not like that. Anyone want to take a guess what this is? Yes. Anyone want to take a guess on what fuel tank? No? Okay, so this is, by best account, a piece of the Saturn II mission, AS-203, a Saturn rocket that was launched to test the upper stage, the S-4B stage. This is a small part of a much larger part, which you can see there, which was found in Zambia. Through Collect Space, we got to know the gentleman. His father was a missionary and came upon a village where this large piece of metal was being used as the roof. Let's see if we can bring it down here. The roof of a building. And it had some lettering on it. They didn't know what it was, but the father, the missionary, he recognized it as being probably from a rocket because they described as having found it after it fell out of the sky. And so this was in the late 60s, and he marked it down in his journal. In the early 90s, his son and his colleague went trying to trace his father's steps using the journal. They found the little village where this piece of rocket material was sitting on the roof. They offered to build a better roof for them in return for picking up the piece. And they did. And they brought this piece, this specific piece, of a much larger sample, as you can see here, back to Johnson Space Center. And by comparing it with known flights that dropped debris, they found that this was from the AS-203 mission that tested the first upper stage for the Saturn V rocket that took astronauts to the moon. This doesn't happen very often, but if something falls from space, as long as it's not something that the government wants back, it's a way of obtaining material. Skylab, for example, fell over Australia. When it first fell, there were a lot of entrepreneurs who went out searching for pieces, figuring that NASA would buy back all the material, and NASA didn't want any of the material back. So a lot of souvenirs were made out of Skylab pieces. There was one piece that NASA wanted back that was never found, and it was the only piece that might have survived intact. It was a large film vault, which was aboard the station. It held all the film that was taken from the solar observatories and from the Earth's observation that they did, and that piece, about the size of a school bus, was never found. So it's either at the bottom of the ocean somewhere or sitting in a very deep trench somewhere in the outback, or maybe being used as someone's stage or something. So if that's ever found, that piece NASA would like to at least see at this point. The primary way that space artifacts get out into the private hands is through presentation by NASA to employees and to their astronauts, and also through surplus auctions. And I'll touch on the surplus auction in a second. But as an example of that, since this is SpaceUp, anyone know what? If you saw this yesterday, don't answer. But does anyone know what this is? It's a pneumatic tube. This is from Mission Control. It is the predecessor to email. So if you've ever been to the bank and have used their drive-through, you pull up, you open up a tube very much like this, but much lighter because it's not metal, and you stick in whatever your deposit or whatever else, and you send it through the vacuum tubes. This is the same concept. It was what was used in Mission Control. And this particular one, does anyone know who White Flight was? Yes, Gene Kranz. So Gene Kranz, flight director. By the time this was his Apollo-Soyuz pneumatic tube. By the time of the Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975, he was no longer the flight director, but in management at Johnson Space Center, at the Manned Spacecraft Center. And so, given the historic nature of this mission, he really wanted to be in mission control. And so another flight controller by the name of Cy Liebergott, who was in ECOM, and who, if you saw the movie Apollo 13, he was played by Clint Howard, Ron Howard's brother, and was the gentleman who looks back up at Ed Harris as Gene Kranz and says, "From my seat here, this is the only option about shutting down the fuel cells." But anyway, Cy writes inside this P-tube was created by me and presented to Gene Kranz, who acted as my P-tube operator during the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And that is exactly how how it was received. It was given away at a splashdown party, and there are a lot of people out there who have pieces like this as presentations like that. As they've gotten older in the program, Gene decided to auction and sell most of his memorabilia online to benefit his local church here in Houston, and that's how this piece came about. Today's astronauts get to keep things too, not a lot. This is a shirt that flew on STS-44 with one of the crew members. This was amongst a collection of a few crew shirts that he had. He was the first to consign them to an auction, and they sold for between $750 and $1,000. When he realized that they were that valuable, he stopped using them for what he had been using them before, which was to do chores around his house, paint his house, and a lot of other astronauts followed suit. So you still see material like this come out into the public. This is another example of an astronaut souvenir. When the space shuttle's sitting on the pad, it's held down to the pad by 8 hold-down posts. They are held by a very large bolt and a complete one of these, which is a frangible nut. This is 1/2 of a nut that held onto the bolt. At launch, at liftoff, this has explosive charges and separates in half. 1/2 falls onto the pad, the other half falls into a catch on the solid rocket boosters and takes the flight with the solid rocket booster. This particular one flew on the side that flew with the solid rocket booster on the mission that deployed the Hubble Space Telescope. But these are popularly given out to the astronaut crews as bookends. And if you see me afterwards and feel this is quite heavy, and you can see why. There's another caution on this. Not a lot of these come into private ownership. This is a frangible nut, and while most of the explosives are long since gone, it's a wonder what TSA can still pick up. So you might not want to travel with this, or at least allow a couple hours at the airport before you show up. Pieces are presented. Sometimes mistakes lead to them not being presented to the individuals that they want to be presented to. Does anyone recognize what the shape of these metal components are without looking at what the inscription is? Sorry? That would be one. Think unmanned and a different location. Viking. So these are actual scraps taken from the Viking Lander before it was launched, and fabricated to look like the Viking Lander. I don't know if you can see what it says, but it says, "Presented to the Honorable Gerald R. Ford, the President of the United States. Viking landing on Mars, July 4th, 1976, actual lander material." Anyone recognize what the problem and why I'm holding on to this and not the presidential library, Ford's presidential library? Viking was supposed to land on July 4th on the centennial, and there were big activities planned for that. When they arrived into Martian orbit, they found that their planned landing site was not as smooth as they had hoped it would be. And so NASA took a couple extra weeks to figure out where to land. And so they actually landed on July 20th, 1976. They couldn't present one that said the wrong thing to the President of the United States, and so they ended up never presenting one to the President of the United States. This floated around between Martin Marietta hands and was eventually auctioned. I've since contacted the Ford Museum and spoken to their curator about whether there was any record of a Martin Marietta meeting set up to present this or where it was going to happen. They have no record of it, but they're very interested in obtaining it. And so we've talked about donating it to the museum for their collection if they have a space display to put it out on. And I should mention, all these artifacts, while starting off as a personal collection, are now the basis of what we do at CollectSpace to try to provide material to museums and science centers and educational institutions to flesh out larger exhibits for about space history. And we come to conferences like this one to show off that as well. So let me back up a little bit and point out a collectible that you can get right now, and is not incredibly valuable, but it's something that demonstrates the way that spaceflight is a unpredictable business. Some of you have heard that Space Shuttle Discovery mission was originally included a crew member named Tim Kopra. Unfortunately, Tim was injured, and he will not be on the flight. Stephen Bowen replaced him, but because it's so late in the process of replacing him on the crew patch and just about everything else that was produced to support the mission has Copra's name on it. And they are frantically trying to replace that with a similar version with Bowen's name on it, but not all that's going to happen. And so people have started collecting the Copra version of the patch in order to then show it next to the Bowen version of the patch as it comes out. This is not the first time this has happened, and there will probably be a whole lot of patches on board Discovery with Tim's name on it. So maybe he's not flying, but his name is going instead. But it's not the first time it's happened. In 1987, Gennady Manikov was a cosmonaut who was assigned to command the Soyuz TM-24 mission. 5 days before flight, he registered some heart problems. He was taken off the mission because Russia at that time had backups for every one of their crew. Not only was he taken off the mission, but his pilot was taken off the mission as well. It was a two-man crew, so his pilot Pavel Vanagradov was taken off the mission as well, and he was replaced by Valery Korzun. So they launched to the Mir space station. That was fine. Gennady was on the ground. He'd be assigned to a later flight. And a month later, the U.S. launched STS-79, space shuttle mission headed to the Mir space station. It had already been packed with supplies for the Mir crew, the original Mir crew that was supposed to be there. And amongst those were these Adidas sneakers. These were Gennady Manikov's sneakers. Valery Korzun tried them on in space and found they didn't fit. So he sent them back down to the ground, but not before doing something that establishes how things fly on, how you can tell things have flown in space. On board Mir and on board the International Space Station now, there is a Russian post office, and they have markers, ink stampers that they use to cancel the mail. Well, they use it to cancel just about everything else too, and so they stamped the toes of these sneakers and sent them back down as a souvenir for Gennady. And so he got these as a souvenir of the flight he never took. His shoes went and he didn't. And so this is an example of how you can work if you have the ability to watch space auctions, if you know any astronauts, if you know watch eBay even, you can find items that come out of astronauts' collections. The other side of things is surplus auctions. NASA surpluses a lot. They come out of government surplus auctions. They are not designed for the public to bid on, because what the way they do it is it's meant as surplus. So they put a whole lot of items into one big lot, and a scrap dealer will probably buy that up and break it apart. But examples of stuff that have come out recently: this is a speaker set that was the type that was flown aboard the space shuttle, and the classic answer of how do you go to the bathroom in space. This is a urine collection device, both out of JSC collections here, never used. Neither of these flew, but examples of space hardware that just no longer had a purpose. And you can find eBay dealers who, scrap dealers who purchased at the government auctions and then sell them on eBay. What you want to be careful of is just proof of that it was legally obtained. Ask them for the invoices from government auctions. Ask them for how they received it. You don't want to end up purchasing something that was lifted out of the workplace. Let's see what else I So I've talked a little bit right now about surplus stuff. I want to give out a couple of pieces of surplus stuff. First, let's see. Any questions so far about, or any questions on anything related to space? And we'll, Liz?
What happens if you do buy something off eBay? You don't ask for any kind of materials or anything, but it turns out that it is improperly obtained. Are you legally liable for owning something that you bought from somebody who stole it?
You can be legally liable. Well, you will not be. You're not at fault in the sense that you will not be prosecuted, but it doesn't mean that you get to keep the piece either. It's a situation where it's up to the prosecutor who's going after the seller for stealing the material about what they want to do. I'm not a lawyer, so I should preface it by saying that, please consult your lawyer before taking any legal advice from anyone else. But for the example of the space shuttle tiles that were recently sold on eBay and were stolen from NASA's property, the district attorney in that case has said, or actually the sheriff in that case has said that they're not going after the buyers because they didn't know the material was stolen. They're only going after the seller. There have been cases where material was stolen, and because NASA wanted the material back because it was of still use to them, they did request, well, more than request, the item back from the collector, and you had no legal title to it. But NASA wasn't also the agency to get your money back either. You needed to file a civil suit against the seller to get to recoup your money. So there are some pitfalls, and that's why you want to double check before purchasing anything that there is a legal chain of ownership before owning anything. Sorry.
Somewhat of a similar question, but what about items that are thrown out unknowingly by NASA?
Well, NASA does a very good job of checking things before they throw them out. It used to be at one point in its history that if it ended up in the dumpster, the employee could legally dumpster dive and take items out if it was not metal content, because metal content was recycled and they got their 5-cent deposit back. So you could dumpster dive on soft goods. That's no longer the case. You would have to wait for it to leave the property to get to a scrap yard before you could obtain it legally. It's not something that you can just bag and tag, throw into your trash can at work and wait till after work and pull it out. There were examples of that in prior years. Which I forgot to pack. For example, I forgot I had my website open. So these are the boot labels off of James Van Hoften's boots. They were used in the Solar Max repair. If you've seen the IMAX movie Destiny, Dream is Alive. The labels were removed from the boot assembly afterwards because the boots are reused, but you don't need the label any longer. The spacesuit tech that was working that bagged and tagged them as if they were going to be used again, but instead threw them in the trash. And at the time it was legal. He waited till afterwards, till the trash was collected, and he found them in the trash afterwards and took them away as a souvenir. NASA's Office of the Inspector General cleared it, and so it was something for him to legally own as a souvenir. You don't want to do that any longer. It will get you in trouble. Just to give an overview quickly of a couple of different types of items, or actually to give away some space memorabilia. See how I can do this.
How would you
Yes?
get the value, the price of something? Is there a market that would help you to identify this is super valuable and this is not?
The market exists. Space memorabilia has been on the market since the early 1990s as in terms of any regular availability. But it's still young. I mean, the entire space program is 50 years old, and so So there hasn't been enough time for there to be a normalization of the market to the point that there could be a price guide printed and said, flags that flew on this mission are worth this much, and flags that flew on that mission are not. There is a hierarchy. If it has been to the surface of the moon, then it is the holy grail amongst space collectors. If it's been to lunar orbit, it's just after that. Then Earth orbit for anything that was on the early missions: Mercury, Vostok, Gemini, Voskhod, and then the later missions: Space Shuttle, Space Station, Mir, Soyuz, as sort of the pecking order of items that have flown in space. Autographs and collectibles, anything related to it almost follows the same pattern. Anything related to Apollo 11 is usually at a premium, the first lunar landing, and anything related to pivotal missions like the first space shuttle launch, the last space shuttle launch coming up, the first Mercury missions and such like that have particular value. With artifacts and collectibles, the better, if it has a story, the more behind it, the more interest there is. I told the story of the sneakers. If you can tell an interesting story with it, there's more of a chance of grabbing other people's attention. If it's just a bolt that sat in amongst 20 other bolts and flew, it may not have as much of an interest. There's still a market for it, but it's not something that grabs a lot of attention. Let me see. I did bring some stuff to give away, and I just lost. Oh, there. So the first, I will give, with the exception of one person in the audience who I think knows what this is, I will give one of these away to someone who can figure out what this is. This came out of surplus. It was a surplus auction. Does anyone recognize what this is?
The rubber seal.
For? I'm not going to make it that easy.
You know what that looks? It looks like the thing, if you ever go to the McDonald's Space Observatory, they have these platforms and these rubber seals that lift up the telescope.
Okay. It's not that, but good guess. No. If it was that, I don't think I'd give that away. Or I wouldn't, be handling it like this. I will give a hint. It's related to astronaut equipment. Okay, all three of you said it at the same time. Fortunately, I've got three of them, so.
So what is it again?
So I'll demonstrate it in a second here if I can get my large head through this.
Wear it?
So I'll try to pull up a picture as well. I wanted to bring up one earlier. If you've seen the orange pumpkin suits that the astronauts wear on launch day and to come back from space, exactly. So if you look at the pictures of them, they've got a and let's see if I can do this quickly. Google is your friend, and I apologize in advance if anything inappropriate comes up in Google. All right, Wikipedia is our friend. Let's see if there's a better shot. There we go. Brilliant. Okay, so as you can see here, he's got a black rubber collar around. This is, I would not recommend the ones who got this for pulling it over their head. It's a tight rubber seal. Even if it was fitted to your head, it would be a tight rubber seal because it's meant to keep the pressure in the suit. I did try once to pull it over my head. I got it successfully over, and then I couldn't breathe. Of course, this wasn't fitted to my head either. On the suits themselves, they have clips on the neck ring that you'll see them commonly wear on launch day before they get on board, where it's pulling the rubber back from their neck to release that pressure. So even when well fitted, but these were surplus ones that were fitted for a crew and were not used.
Is that when they said it was like giving birth?
Yeah, in terms of putting your head through it, they've described it.
Giving birth is like being born.
Being born.
Sorry, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have another set of things. So, let me see if I can bring it up here. I wish this was a Mac.
One here. That like ruby slippers? Yes.
Let's do it this way. Yes, we prefer the Space Store because they are our partners at Collect Space. Okay, so I mentioned that Alan Shepard's, the 50th anniversary of Alan Shepard's flight is coming up. Can someone tell me what's wrong with this patch? Yes. Why? Who said that, by the way? Okay.
They didn't have patches until later, but I don't remember how much later.
So yes, so anytime you see a Mercury patch, all the way up through Gemini 5, you're looking at a complete fabrication made for sale to the public. Gemini 5 was the first mission to have a mission patch designed by the crew. Gemini 4 had a mission patch, or something they called their mission patch. Does anyone know what that was? Yes. They were the first crew to wear the American flag, and they considered it to be a patch, their patch. Who said, I know that you did, but you already won something. Who said the thing about this patch being... No, I did. So not this patch, but they did have a Mercury 7 symbol that the astronauts actually endorsed.
Oh, wow.
And so these patches were specifically made up for the 50th anniversary. They're not available to any store. They're just being given out to people who are related to the program. And who said about the flag? We'll give away a couple more things in a few minutes here, but I wanted to touch on, and I'll go back to the mic for the people online, is that I've spoken a lot about the types of items that have come out of the program and about collecting them. I want to back up a little bit and just mention that collecting as a hobby can be personally rewarding, but it's also something that serves a very important purpose. A lot of the talks here at SpaceUp have been about getting the public interested in space and doing our part to move the space program forward. Museums serve a great purpose. They save a lot of the major artifacts that need to be in museums, spacesuits, spacecraft, and such. But by their very nature, they're not set up to catch the nuts and bolts that fall through the cracks. And if they're not caught, they're the types of things that end up being recycled into Coke cans. And as cool as I find it that you might be drinking your Diet Coke out of something that has a little bit of metal that might have been in space before, it serves a lot better purpose to have those pieces saved by collectors and by members of the public who can then bring them into their communities. I feel very strong that, and I think a lot of collectors do, that being a space collector is not just about owning something and saying, how cool am I that I own this? It's about being a custodian for future generations and for the current generation, that if you have these types of items and if you can acquire them, then it's your responsibility to share them. Set up time to go into schools, talk to your local library about setting up exhibits, go to conferences like this one and bring it for show and tell. There's show and tell sessions as at this one as set up. If you can do interviews with the local media, when there are missions going on, if you have something related to it, even as it's simple as a patch, if you can talk to the history of it, then they will listen to you. And join the community and find support from there. I mean, I don't want to make this sound like a plug for Collect Space, but we have every day between 20 and 50 live conversations going on about every aspect related to space history, whether it's what would have happened if Ken Mattingly actually flew on Apollo 13 instead of Jack Swigert, to what is this patch and where can I find it elsewhere. A lot of times space history collectibles, whether it's a patch or an autograph or a artifact, is looked at as something of being not part of the advocacy movement and the education movement. And I think that this is an opportunity where you can put something in someone's hands and really get them excited about space without being overly technical. If you we had a moon rock here yesterday, and I saw a lot of people come up and look at it and oogle at it, and that's the way it should be. There are moon rocks at other museums, and they and the one at the National Air and Space Museum is one of the touchstones where it's one of the most popular exhibits in the world. But while we can't own moon rocks legally, you can't own moon rocks. If you own a moon rock, please. Well, you don't own a moon rock, let's put it that way. There's a lot of other items that you can own, from the very inexpensive, like a patch, to super expensive, like flown in space hardware that can start at $100 and go up. But it's a way of getting a tactile response to the space program. And until we can all fly in space and all have that experience, this is an opportunity for us to bring space down to Earth, pardon the pun, to the general public. When I go out and I bring out artifacts, even to non-space interested audiences, there's a change that happens once they get to hold on to something that's been in space. And it's that simple. And if it's been to the moon, even better. So I leave you with that message. But let me see if I have anything else here to show, or I'll give away a couple other items. And I really don't have any concept of where my time is. Okay. So I do want to let you out to be able to see the Space Exploration Rover, an awesome future artifact sitting out in the parking lot right now. But to give away a couple of more of these, now that you know what they are, I do have to save a couple. I will come up quickly with a trivia question. Someone has a trivia question? Okay.
I believe I'm correct on this one.
Okay. Well, I'll go back to one that might be a little too simple. And I just blanked on the simple question. Good. All right, so we'll do this a little more simply. Who amongst you? Yes.
I have a couple more questions.
Okay.
And this one's kind of good but basic.
Okay. 1 second. Okay, well, since this is interactive, we'll ask the question that was submitted. Which of the orbiters... All right, so there is a system on board the orbiters, aboard the Space Shuttle orbiters, that allows the Space Shuttle to draw power from the space station, so it can stay there longer. The orbiters were modified to have that system placed on board, but not all of them were. One orbiter... Yes, it is.
Way to go, Ben.
So, Ben, I'll give you that afterwards. And that's really not fair because Ben's favorite orbiter is Atlantis, as wrong as he may be.
I hear they're all the same.
And I will. All right. So this artifact is from something called the ACES spacesuit, which I showed on screen. Who knows what ACES stands for? That was simultaneous. Wow. So who were the two? And Ben, I have one for you. So who were the? Who just said it in unison? Okay. Look, in the space.
We were fair on that question because we gave them all.
And I will, for those who got the bladders, the neck bladder, if you email me at CollectSpace, robert@collectspace.com, or if you come to me afterwards, I will email you a information sheet about them as well as a scan of the paperwork, so no one can ever say that you did not get that legally. Wouldn't want to set a bad example. I'd encourage you all to visit collectspace.com and join the community, join the conversation, even if you're not into space artifacts. And if you have any other questions about space history or space collectibles, I'd be happy to answer them here or afterwards.
Well, this afternoon I'm going to be giving a session that's going to include different types of space photos that I've taken, historic things, and some books. So, but anyway, and maybe a little personal history for me on some of the items there.
Great.
But I'd love for you to come too.
Okay, great. So I will let you all head out and see the Space Exploration rover. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'd have lunch, I think.
Are you giving away more of those Mercury patches?
For those of you watching online, I'm going to go mobile. You're going to lose pod 1 for a moment. Stay tuned to pod 1. I'm actually going to bring you outside with me. So just let it go to the slate and you'll come right back up when you see the ad. Oh, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Awesome.
Who was the one who just asked about the Mercury Patch?
So I started collecting patches, so I had the other ones. Thank you. Oh, and this was in the stores.
Yep.
Embroidered right on the shirt.
Designed by Michael Jones.
Really? I have his autograph. Well, I have a picture of Volatosaurus signed by Roxanne Dawson. It says from one tourist to another. Because the Cudas came and I got their autographs in the book. And then Roxanne stopped by their office and I got it. I was working at NASA. How did you get something from Paramount? I just talk to people.
I have a question for if you don't mind.
For not stop the live
Get a
stream.
picture of
That's fine. That's fine.
me holding
But if you're not comfortable with the archive, sure. Remind me as soon as you're done. Just say no archive.
Your hand will probably fit,
Or if you want, I can archive it and then just.
because mine certainly
Do you
doesn't.
want to keep this on, or do you want him to take it off?
He can keep it
All right. I'll just proactively do this. You ever have any issues online?
How's the light work here?
Is there a light?
here.
Can you turn the
It
light
wasn't,
on?
by the way, because it was somewhat all over the place. And
Oh, it's great.
Oh, no, dude.
It was great. Can't really see the glove.
Yeah, just-
Don't get you in it.